Thank you for joining us for 3Bs on the Law podcast, hosted by Trisha Barita, Camille Canali, and Susan Dawson. Disclaimer, this podcast is for entertainment and informational purposes only, not meant to provide legal advice, and does not create an attorney-client relationship. Also remember, laws change or they differ by jurisdiction, so this is not a substitute for seeking legal counsel in your jurisdiction on the current law applicable to you.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to May the Force Majeure be with you. So this episode is to discuss a contract clause that's not used a lot, but is often thrown into contracts. And most people haven't ever taken the time to read it and don't really understand what it means. And so in simplest terms, it's acts of God. You may be excused from performance of a contract if an act of God occurred. And we're seeing a lot of discussion about force majeure clauses as a result of COVID and the pandemic and supply chain issues and delivery issues. But before we get to our discussion on COVID, I know Susan, as an enormous Star Wars fan, has been so excited about this episode. And she has a great Star Wars hypothetical as to how force majeure may come into play. So Susan, take it away.
Well, it's a based off of, just taking the movies, throwing them out there. Sorry, Trisha, there's no Ewoks in the description. I do apologize.
That was the one thing Trisha asked for, Susan.
I know, Trisha specifically wanted Ewoks and Yoda, and they don't cross paths. So that was just not something I could accomplish for you.
I'm sad about that.
All right. So we have Luke, who has hired Han and Chewie to take R2-D2 to Alderaan on the Millennium Falcon, right? But lo and behold, they come out of hyperspace and they're in a meteor shower and there's no Alderaan. And all of a sudden they're caught in a tractor beam. They're not able to deliver R2-D2 to Alderaan because they're pulled into the Death Star. What do we do? Do we have a force majeure event?
Well, given that I know that Han Solo and Chewie managed to escape every single bad situation somehow, I don't think we do.
But there's no Alderaan. Alderaan doesn't exist. You can't possibly deliver R2-D2, even if they do escape the Death Star.
So in that case, yes. If the destination has been blown into oblivion, then I think, yes, you have a force majeure action and you have a good defense to a contract.
Right. I think that's the sillier question, but I think the better question would be, what if it was just a delay, right? What if Alderaan hadn't been blown up, they had been pulled up into the Death Star, but they escaped, but they were able to deliver R2-D2. They were just a week late, right?
Or what if, Susan, the meteor shower got in the way of them getting to Alderaan and delaying them? Could the meteor shower been predicted? And then if there was some predictability there, then maybe you can't rely on the force majeure. Because yes, Camille says that it's acts of God, and it is the sort of catch-all phrase we see at the end. If you're looking through your contract for this, know that it's usually near the end of the contract. It's not always called force majeure. It's, sometimes refers to all kinds of things where you see war, hostilities, terrorists, government action, all those types of things. And then acts of God usually are named in there. Here down in Texas, hurricanes are always in there, right? For sure. Nowadays, we'll probably always see pandemics attempted to be put in there, right? But I think that there's that delay issue, right? As to whether or not you could have predicted it. Now, could you have predicted it and done something to prevent it? For instance, down here, sometimes because we're so far in on the Gulf Coast, you may see a hurricane coming. There may be some steps you can take 3 to 4 days out to make sure that you, not rent, probably like commercial rent, which is where you often see these clauses, but maybe if it's a delivery issue or something, you could take steps to protect the product or to do something. And could that have maybe been played into whether the force majeure clause is effective?
Right. And I think it's important to talk about the phrase act of God, right? I mean, and not to get into any kind of debate about the word, but I don't know that that's the, as appropriate. I think what we need to explain is what it means is out of your control. That's really what it means. It's become kind of a term, that people just say that means something that occurred that you could not have predicted or controlled.
Sometimes,
right?
yeah, often natural disaster or government caused or some sort of terrorist event. Now we've seen a lot of that since September 11th. But I think another thing to point out, certainly while we're talking about this, is that this is a contractual term and that generally you're going to be looking at which type of law is applied, which state law. So that's going to vary. How the courts interpret it, based in your jurisdiction is going to be important as well. Force majeures are looked at differently in different areas.
Right. And acts of God can be defined differently. I know there's a whole body of case law in California that discusses what an act of God is and what types of things may fall within that, not just in force majeure, but there's in the government code and things like that. So that's something else to take into consideration is depending upon the state, which your contract, most contracts say this law applies under the state of California or the state of Texas or the state of Illinois. And so what state's laws your contract is interpreted under may actually affect whether or not something is, quote, an act of God.
I think that's a great point, Camille. I would say probably if we have employers or business owners listening to this, I would guess that when they get a contract presented to them, they go to the money number, wherever that is in the contract, right? How much am I going to get for whatever it is I'm going to, or how much am I going to have to pay for whatever it is? I think all three of us would agree that we probably all go to the part of which law applies to this because I'm not going to read whatever many page contract if it's not the particular law that I'm familiar with, of course, which is, Texas law, right? Or we're looking at federal stuff, but yeah, it's kind of an interesting thing. So, if you're listening, maybe go to the part of which law applies so that you do know and look for if there is a force majeure in there and have an understanding of it.
Right. I think that what we're seeing with COVID has been supply chain delays. I recall with many of the businesses that I work with a lot of people in the manufacturing industry, and they were seeing significant delays in January and February before it was really becoming anything that we were thinking about here, because China was shut down and so much of their items, their supplies, what they needed, their inventory came from China. And China shut down, and we weren't able to accept deliveries from China without significant delays. So that causes quite the the trickle down effect, right? Or whatever the proper phrase is. Because if you've got a supplier that can't get the screws to go into the teeny tiny part that goes into the somewhat bigger part that goes into the even bigger part that goes into a car, right? All those people are delayed because a part's going into a part's going into a part's going into a finished product, and it's causing a ripple effect. That's what I was trying to say, a ripple effect.
Yeah.
A delay. And so you have a really complicated force majeure situation there because one person was delayed because of the pandemic in China, couldn't get the part to somebody else. But the second individual, they weren't particularly delayed by China. Right. I mean, I don't want to go through that. That's a really complex force majeure situation, but I think that's what people need to understand is it's a supply chain issue right now, largely is what we're seeing.
Yeah. And closer to home, Camille, California, I know businesses here in Texas couldn't get stuff from California when you guys shut down. Like, when there was the first initial big California shutdown where they were like, that's it. Nobody's doing anything. Nobody's doing, and like, there was a lot of issues where people had products in California and they couldn't get the products here because it wasn't clear that whatever method they were using would be considered exempted from the laws in California.
Right. And I think one of the things you have to look at here and consider is, is it impossible to get it there or is it impractical? And so impossible means you can't do it. But impractical, for example, in a manufacturing situation, things may be delayed, but not impossible. And so that's where I think, I always say communication and documentation, but here that's where communication with your vendors or suppliers, and all of the individuals in the supply chain become important, quite frankly, because you've got to renegotiate so all of you can get the deliveries made, get the products done and out to the ultimate consumer. That's what's important to our economy right now, quite frankly. So I think that's something just to kind of consider, as we're going through this as well, is this whole, even if you are not making as much profit because of the delay, that doesn't make it impossible, and it doesn't necessarily make force majeure come into play.
Right. Allow you to back out of the contract from a force majeure perspective. Right.
So, the facts and the language of the contract, I think, are really going to make or break a particular argument in this case.
It's going to be fascinating, I think, to watch how the courts, from our perspective at least, maybe not so much for everyone, but for the legal nerds out there that like to watch case law and how it develops, to when some of these cases start hitting the appellate courts, right? Because right now, if anyone's suing over this, it's not at a level that the attorneys that are out there reading the appellate court cases and such are going to see. So when courts start interpreting these force majeure clauses, even the ones that had exemptions for pandemics and such, it's going to be interesting to see how they're interpreted. I recall, back at 9/11, right? There were a lot of insurance companies that were saying terrorism was excluded, and then the courts later went through and it was, different results coming out. So the interpretation of pandemic, the effect, what becomes a force majeure and what doesn't, is going to be developing over the next few years. Don't you agree?
I absolutely agree. And I also think the timing of when the contract was entered into may also come into play, because if the contract was entered into after we were already in the throes of this pandemic, I think that there is a potential argument to be made that the pandemic was foreseeable and that should have been taken into account by the parties to the contract.
Yeah, I think I get what you're saying, Camille, because in Texas here, they do tend to want to enforce provisions that the parties should have thought about things, right? That they should have been thoughtful in the way that they drafted the contract and what they agreed to. And like you brought up earlier offline before we got on here, the SARS issue, and that, some people took that and put pandemics into these force majeure and rethinking ahead on that. And now that it's so in everybody's face, it almost is impossible to imagine that you wouldn't be anticipated that the parties were going to either include it or not include it on purpose.
Right. And I mean, and for example, 9/11 is a great example of that. I guarantee you before 9/11 happened, it never occurred to most people that there would be a terrorism attack within the United States of the scope of that attack. And so it wasn't contained in a lot of contracts. And after
I think anticipated in a building would fall down. I think obviously we've had attacks, right? Like Pearl Harbor and all of those. Yeah.
No. I'm saying different than Pearl Harbor and war, but terrorism attacks. It never occurred to me that there would be an attack of that scale,
right,
in the United States.
The magnitude of the attack,
correct,
I think is what Camille is getting at. Yes.
And so before that, I wasn't as familiar or didn't notice terrorism being included in that clause. And after, really my point that I was starting to make was after 9/11, it became, it was in everything,
right?
Not just insurance policies where I was familiar with it, but also in contracts.
I was in law school when September 11th happened. So, I didn't get to read those contracts before then.
You're making us look old.
No, I'm not.
She's making us look experienced, Camille. Not
okay.
old.
Your experience is superior to mine, Camille, clearly.
Right. But going back to Star Wars, your original version of our hypothetical, Camille, talked about the galaxy being at peace, and then what happens if war breaks out in the middle. And that is something we've seen a lot of over my career in law school is wars are breaking out in small parts of the globe where it interrupts supply chain. So there's that that comes up quite a bit. Those have been more litigated. So I think that to your point is if you're going to take it through an area, there's the pirating off the coast of Africa right now, and so if your goods are in that area, there's a good risk of it being stolen. So your point is the date, the timing, and being in understanding where the goods are coming from and understanding the risks. You have to be aware of it. It has to be something that you couldn't have predicted. And from a COVID perspective, if you signed the contract in July and there was a delay in October, well, all the news are saying predict a fall, shutdown. If you sign the contract in January, maybe you have a better argument. Is that what you're saying, Camille?
Yeah, I'm just saying the timing and what you were able to predict at the time may become very important in all of this.
So if the Death Star was already trying to attack them and then they make this contract in the middle of all of that, that could have been predicted.
The Death Star is trying to attack them, Trisha.
I knew I wasn't allowed to talk during this podcast. I don't know enough about Star Wars. I love Star Wars, but my knowledge is limited to the Ewoks and Yoda.
Yeah, well, the Ewoks are very, very cute, but...
I get it. A small piece of your large galaxy.
Getting into my deep dive. I mean, we could bring up hypotheticals from the books if you'd like. I could bring up, hypotheticals from some of the animated shows on TV. I mean, I tried to just go with a New Hope hypothetical.
How about this, Susan?
Mm-hmm.
This can be a podcast to be continued. We will bring Star Wars back in one way or another.
All right.
Multiple times for the future. Don't feel forced to get into everything today, please. For my sake, don't do that.
Thank you for saying force. That was appropriate.
There you go.
For the record, the Star Wars celebration that I was supposed to be going to has been canceled due to force majeure pandemic.
Oh, well, there you go.
This has been a great
conversation. Thank you so much for joining us, and everyone.
May the force majeure be with you.
There you go.
Be with you. Have a great day. Thank you for joining us on today's podcast of 3Bs on the Law. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our podcast. We also welcome any comments. If you'd like to get in touch with us or suggest a future topic, you can email us at 3THREEBsonthelaw@gmail.com. And because we're lawyers, we need to remind you that this podcast is not meant to provide you with legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great day.